I like abstraction, I like clean code, and that's why I like ng include directive. We will start this lecture where we left in our last lecture. So I'm going to use the same complicated version of last lecture HTML, but I have removed some of the unnecessary code. Now look at this table code. It's long. If I need to see it completely, I need to scroll my mouse. I know the fonts are big, but most of the time we are not interested in the details. So I need abstraction of my views. We can use ng include to abstract away the details of our views. So I'm going to move all of my table code out from here to a new file. Now we don't need all of this HTML markup, as this page will be part of my main page. So I'm going to delete all of this markup and paste my table HTML snippet here. Now as I have abstracted away all of my table code, we need some way to have it here on this page, right? So I'm going to use my favorite ng include directive and add an attribute called src source, which will contain the URL for the file I have created previously. Cool. So I'm going to run the application, and there we go. We got our contacts table rendered. So what's happening here? ng include directive load the fragment of HTML using AJAX request, process and compile all of the directives it might contain and adds it to the DOM. We can call this HTML fragments as partial views. The source attribute sets the location of the partial view we want to load, and it's actually is an expression to be evaluated on current scope. So you can see I have specified the file name in single quotes. That means I'm assigning the file name directly inside the attribute as an expression. The other option is to create a variable on $scope object which will point to the contacts.html file and use that variable as an expression here inside the source attribute. So I'm going to refresh the application again, and you can see it's working fine. So this expression opens a lot of new doors for us to use this directive creatively. You can notice one thing. This is the first directive we have written as element. So this directive supports all of the three syntax, that is element, attribute, and class. So I can write a div, then decorate it with ng include attribute and use the source attribute to point to the file location. So I'm going to refresh the application. Awesome. The partial is rendered into the DOM twice. You try using the class syntax. I'm going to keep it as an assignment for you. Now the most important point is all of this partial code gets evaluated under the current scope if we haven't defined any controller inside the partial view, as every controller creates its own scope. So all of the bindings here inside this partial are going to evaluate it under this controller scope. Sounds interesting, right? Now as we know, the source attribute is actually an expression. Why not use it to load different partials based on different condition? So I'm going to create two different views for my contacts data. One we have is a table view, another will be the list view. So I'm going to add one more file here inside my root of the application, say contacts_list.html, remove the HTML, and I'm going to paste the code snippet I have already created to save some time. You can see I'm using the same contacts array defined inside my app controller, and I'm printing just first name and last name of my contact. Now I have two different views for same contacts data. We need some logic to load this partial, right? So I'll remove this second ng include to keep my code clean, and I'll add a checkbox, use ng module directive, which will create an attribute called view state on my $scope object, and I'm going to give it a label of toggle list view. Now as I said, this source attribute can have the expression. So I'm going to call a function which will return me the partial URL to be rendered in the DOM. Let's write this function on $scope object, which is going to check for the view state value, and if it's true, it will return us list view partial, or if it's false, it will return us table view partial. So I'm going to refresh. So we go to the table view, as that's the default case. Now let's toggle by clicking on the toggle list view checkbox. There we go. Awesome. Partials are loading on demand based on condition. And look at the HTML. It's so clean, and if you're interested in more details, you can open this partials and look at them. Even we can reuse the partials if required. Now, before concluding this lecture, there is one more attribute that might be useful to execute some code after the partial is loaded. That's called onload, and we can specify the function name here as its value. So I'm going to write this function on my dollar scope and do some logging. Let's refresh, open the console, and there we go. We can see which partial got loaded. If I toggle my view, we are getting the same. One more important point I would like to share: when we toggle the views, ng-include removes the previously loaded content from DOM. This is really good for performance.